Long before her name was whispered through the corridors of medieval mysticism, Lilith existed in the ancient imagination of Mesopotamia. Not as a demon, nor a symbol of rebellion, but as a presence woven into the mysteries of creation itself. Her story begins not in the Bible, but in the cracked clay tablets of Sumer, written thousands of years before Genesis took form. There, in a language as old as the dawn, we find echoes of a feminine force both alluring and terrifying, a figure known as Lilith. The Lilith were described as spirits of the wind, moving between the world of the living and the unseen. They were not purely evil. Rather, they embodied a dual nature, representing the untamed aspects of existence that early civilizations struggled to name. To the Sumerians, the universe was not divided between good and evil as later traditions would frame it. Instead, creation was a delicate balance between order and chaos, light and shadow, and Lilith, or the Lilith, belonged to that sacred equilibrium. In the temple hymns of Inanna, the goddess of love and war, there is mention of a great tree in the sacred garden of Uruk. In its roots dwelled a serpent, in its trunk a spirit maiden, a Lilith, and in its crown the great bird Anzu. This triad of serpent, spirit, and bird reflected the ancient understanding of life's cycle: the underworld, the human realm, and the heavens. When scholars centuries later encountered the mysterious figure of Lilith, they found in her this same archetype: the being who bridges worlds, untamed and free. As the centuries passed, Mesopotamian mythology evolved, spreading westward into Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian traditions. There, the Lilith began to take on new forms, associated with the night, the desert winds, and the mysterious cries heard in the darkness. But it would be a mistake to view these stories merely as superstition. They were reflections of how the ancients saw the feminine principle of nature: wild, fertile, unpredictable, and sacred. Lilith's earliest form was not that of a curse, but of freedom unbound by structure. When these ancient tales reached the lands of Canaan and eventually merged with early Hebrew thought, something profound occurred. The cosmic balance of Sumer was replaced by a moral hierarchy: one God, one order, one truth. In this new framework, the wild feminine became something to be subdued, and Lilith, who once danced in the night winds as a symbol of autonomy, began to fall into shadow. Yet even in this transformation, her image persisted. The prophet Isaiah spoke of a screech owl, the Lilith, dwelling in desolate places, surrounded by creatures of ruin. To later interpreters, this became more than a poetic image. It was seen as a reference to a fallen being, a remnant of the ancient chaos from before divine order. But behind that line of scripture still lingers the echo of older tongues, whispers of a being who once represented the mysteries of creation itself. It is in this space, between myth and scripture, that Lilith begins to change form entirely. Medieval texts, drawing from both Jewish mysticism and Babylonian lore, reimagined her as Adam's first companion before Eve. In this retelling, she was formed from the same earth as man, equal, independent, unwilling to bow. And when she refused submission, she fled the garden, choosing exile over obedience. This was not the Lilith of Sumer, nor the Lilith of Isaiah, but a synthesis, the meeting of ancient myth with theological imagination. Her defiance, interpreted through the lens of moral order, became rebellion. Her flight from Eden, once a symbol of freedom, became a curse. But beneath these transformations lies something deeply human: the fear and fascination of our ancestors toward the feminine force that could not be controlled. Lilith became a vessel for what society could not reconcile: the sacred autonomy of the human spirit. In later Kabbalistic writings, she appears again, no longer merely myth, but symbol. There, she represents the unbalanced power of the left side of the divine emanations, a shadow reflection of the holy feminine. To the mystics, Lilith was not an enemy of God but part of the hidden architecture of creation, a necessary polarity that mirrored the eternal tension between mercy and justice, light and darkness. In this sense, she was not the destroyer, but the revealer. To understand Lilith, one must step beyond the idea of good and evil and into the ancient view of wholeness. She is the night wind that stirs the waters of consciousness, the whisper that reminds humanity that even within divine creation, there remains mystery: the unformed, the wild, the unknowable. Her story is not a tale of sin, but of balance lost and found again through time. As her myth traveled from Babylon to Judea, From the Aramaic incantation bowls of the 1st century to the medieval manuscripts of Europe, Lilith's form became a mirror for each era's understanding of womanhood, autonomy, and spiritual power. In some ages, she was feared, in others, revered. But through them all, one truth remained: she could never be erased. Her name endured in the margins of sacred texts, in the chants of exorcists, and in the secret lore of mystics who understood that every shadow holds the seed of light. This is where our exploration begins, not with the demon of later superstition, but with the ancient goddess whose essence flows beneath the surface of civilization's oldest stories. To uncover the hidden pagan truth about Lilith is to follow the thread that connects the dawn of myth to the soul of humanity itself. When the ancients gazed upon the night sky, they did not see emptiness. They saw a living realm, inhabited by forces both creative and destructive. In the lands of Sumer and Akkad, the night was not a time of fear but of reverence. It was the domain of Inanna, the goddess of love and descent, and among her spirits moved the enigmatic Lilith. These beings were said to drift on the desert winds, carrying whispers from the unseen world. They were not demons in the modern sense but manifestations of energies that defied classification. Wild, liminal, and deeply feminine. To the people of ancient Mesopotamia, the desert represented both death and revelation. It was in the wilderness that kings sought visions, where prophets were called, and where spirits like the Lilith roamed freely between realms. The Sumerians believed that every aspect of life, fertility, storms, illness, desire, was governed by unseen entities, each reflecting a fragment of the divine whole. The Lilith symbolized independence from divine hierarchy. She did not serve a temple, nor submit to a god. She was an echo of primordial chaos, a reminder that creation itself was born from disorder. Archaeologists have uncovered amulets and incantations invoking protection from the Lamashtu, a related feminine spirit sometimes conflated with Lilith. The Lamashtu was feared for her association with disease and misfortune, yet she also represented the dark side of maternity, a spiritual reflection of nature's indifference. This duality, protector and predator, mother and destroyer, lies at the heart of all ancient goddess traditions. In this sense, Lilith and the Lamashtu were not villains, but mirrors of the divine mystery that the ancients saw everywhere around them. As the civilizations of the Fertile Crescent evolved, their myths began to intertwine. The Sumerian Lilith became the Akkadian Lilith, the Assyrian Lilith, and eventually the Hebrew Lilith. Across centuries, her form shifted with language and theology, but the essence remained, a spirit who moved at the edge of order, neither divine nor mortal, embodying the raw freedom that human institutions could not contain. When these stories crossed into Hebrew culture, they encountered a new worldview, one centered not on many gods but on one. Monotheism required a separation between the holy and the profane. The old balance between chaos and creation could no longer stand unchallenged. Thus, figures like Lilith, once symbols of divine independence, became cast into shadow. What had been sacred chaos was now called rebellion. What had been natural mystery became moral danger. Yet even as theology redefined her, the memory of the older Lilith endured. The book of Isaiah's mention of the Lilith, a solitary spirit dwelling in the ruins, suggests that her legend had already taken root in Hebrew imagination by the 7th century BCE. In that single verse, scholars find the trace of an ancient continuity. The desert spirit, the night wanderer, the embodiment of what lies beyond human control. The wilderness, after all, was not merely physical, it was spiritual. It represented everything untamed within the human soul. The evolution of Lilith from Mesopotamian spirit to biblical symbol mirrors a deeper transformation within humanity itself. The struggle to understand the feminine principle not as subordinate, but as integral to creation. In older traditions, the goddess was not merely an assistant to the gods. She was creation itself, the womb of heaven and earth. But as patriarchal structures took hold, this power was gradually reinterpreted as a threat. Lilith, in many ways, became the scapegoat for that transition, a divine archetype recast as a warning. During the Babylonian exile, when the Hebrew people lived among the ruins of the empire that had first birthed Lilith's name, they would have seen her imagery carved into clay, her name written in the cuneiform of their captors. It was perhaps inevitable that she would find her way into their spiritual consciousness. But what began as cultural borrowing would, over time, become transformation. The Lilith would be absorbed into the growing mythos of Jewish mysticism, reshaped to reflect moral lessons, theological order, and cosmic balance. By the early centuries of the Common Era, Lilith had become more than a name. She was a symbol of the ungoverned forces that humanity feared yet could not eradicate. In the incantation bowls of Babylon, clay vessels inscribed with Aramaic spells, her name appears often, invoked not to curse, but to protect. Families would bury these bowls beneath their homes, their inscriptions forming spirals that trapped wandering spirits. These were not objects of hate, but of harmony. They acknowledged the existence of the unseen world and sought to coexist with it. It was only in the medieval period that Lilith's image darkened fully. Texts such as the alphabet of Ben Sira reimagined her not as a distant spirit, but as the first woman, Adam's equal. In this story, both were formed from the same earth, but Lilith refused to lie beneath him, insisting instead on equality. When Adam rejected her defiance, she uttered a sacred name and flew from the garden, choosing exile rather than submission. This act, interpreted by some as pride, by others as liberation, marked the rebirth of an ancient symbol in new theological language. The rabbis of later centuries, working to maintain moral order in their communities, redefined the story to warn against disobedience and temptation. Yet mystics, poets, and later philosophers saw something else, a reflection of the divine feminine exiled from creation, waiting to be understood once again. Lilith's refusal became the echo of the goddess' lost sovereignty, the moment when humanity's unity with nature fractured into hierarchy. In this way, Lilith stands as a bridge between worlds, between polytheism and monotheism, between myth and theology, between fear and reverence. Her story is the shadow of history itself, the suppressed memory of a time when the sacred included both order and chaos, both man and woman, both light and shadow. And to truly uncover the hidden pagan truth about Lilith, we must look deeper, not only at the texts that condemned her, but at the civilizations that first celebrated what she represented, the eternal freedom of the human spirit. As we journey further into her story, we find her presence not only in scripture, but in the very fabric of mythology itself, in the goddesses who came before her, and in the symbols that carried her essence across continents. For Lilith, in truth, is not one figure, but a reflection of many. Inanna of Sumer, Ishtar of Babylon, Anat of Canaan, and even the primordial Tiamat, the dragon mother of creation. Through each of them, the same archetype shines through, the untamed, creative, and eternal feminine. As civilization advanced, the figure of Lilith continued to move, silent, shifting, adapting to every culture that tried to define her. She became a vessel for humanity's evolving perception of the sacred feminine, the unseen, and the forbidden. Each civilization that touched her name reshaped it, reflecting its own fears and longings. To trace Lilith's transformation is to trace the path of humanity itself, from the harmony of the ancient world to the moral hierarchies of later ages. By the time the ancient Hebrews compiled the writings that would become the Tanakh, the old Sumerian world had already fallen into ruin. The ziggurats stood like skeletons in the dust, and the language of cuneiform had faded from memory. Yet myths are resilient. They travel not through stone but through human imagination, carried in fragments and metaphors. Lilith survived, not as a goddess or spirit, but as an echo of something older, something that had once stood beside creation itself. The biblical world inherited not only the geography of Mesopotamia but its spiritual memory. The wilderness, the serpent, the divine feminine, all these elements had ancient precedents. Yet within the monotheistic framework, the feminine divine was no longer a deity to be worshipped but an aspect of creation to be ordered. This shift, subtle yet immense, marks one of the great turning points in human consciousness. And Lilith, the untamed feminine, became the mirror through which that transformation could be seen. The Talmudic references to Lilith describe her as a being with wings, long hair, and the power to deceive or seduce, qualities drawn not from moral invention but from the iconography of the Mesopotamian goddesses and spirits that preceded her. In the Old World, hair was a symbol of power, fertility, and spiritual potency. Wings represented transcendence and divine mobility. But in the New Theology, these same symbols were inverted. What had once been sacred was now seen as dangerous. Thus, the attributes of divinity were reinterpreted as signs of corruption. Lilith's wings, once a mark of celestial freedom, became the mark of her fall. It is crucial to understand that ancient texts were never written in isolation. Every myth, every scripture, every legend is part of a great tapestry of human experience, a shared attempt to articulate the mystery of existence. The figure of Lilith emerges from that tapestry not as an enemy of faith, but as a reminder of what faith itself must confront: the shadow that balance requires. To deny the shadow is to deny half of creation. This understanding is found most profoundly in the mystical traditions of Kabbalah. There, the cosmos is structured through the Sphirot, 10 emanations of divine light. Yet alongside the tree of life exists its reflection, the Qliphoth or shells, representing imbalance and distortion. Within this duality, Lilith appears not as a separate being but as part of the cosmic tension that sustains reality. The Kabbalists understood that light and darkness are not opposites but complements, each necessary to reveal the other. In their writings, Lilith was sometimes called the Queen of the Night, the consort of the shadow realm, the echo of the divine feminine unbalanced. She was said to dwell near the roots of the Tree of Knowledge, a symbol that recalls her earliest Sumerian image, the spirit maiden in the sacred tree of Inanna's garden. The parallels are unmistakable. From Sumer to Kabbalah, from the clay tablets of Uruk to the mystic scrolls of Safed, Lilith's myth retains its essence. The woman of the tree, the guardian of forbidden wisdom. The tree of knowledge itself is a profoundly ancient symbol. Long before it appeared in Genesis, trees were seen as bridges between worlds, roots in the underworld, trunk in the human realm, branches reaching the heavens. To eat from the tree was to awaken. To guard it was to hold the boundary between ignorance and enlightenment. Lilith's presence at this boundary suggests something extraordinary, that she was not a mere outcast, but a keeper of divine mystery, the threshold between innocence and awareness. The later association of Lilith with temptation likely arose from this ancient imagery. In many myths, the serpent and the woman are intertwined symbols of transformation. The serpent sheds its skin. The woman gives life. Both represent cycles of renewal and the capacity for change. When the story of Eden emerged, it drew upon this deep symbolic heritage. The serpent who tempts, the woman who chooses knowledge. These are echoes of older myths of descent and awakening. And behind them, the spirit of Lilith lingers, the one who left paradise in search of truth beyond obedience. It is here that her story takes on a philosophical dimension. For what is freedom without consequence? What is knowledge without pain? Lilith's departure from Eden represents not merely rebellion but the birth of consciousness itself, the moment humanity began to question divine order. She is the archetype of the seeker, the one who refuses to remain in the comfort of ignorance. Her exile mirrors the soul's own journey through doubt, desire, and revelation. In the writings of later mystics, Lilith became entwined with the figure of Samhael, often portrayed as the angel of severity or destruction. Their union was described as the shadow reflection of Adam and Eve. Yet even here, symbolism prevails over literalism. Samhael represents divine justice, the side of creation that enforces consequence. Lilith, divine autonomy, the side that resists control. Together they embody the cosmic tension that drives creation forward. Without this tension, the world would fall into stillness. Perfection without movement, light without shadow, being without becoming. The medieval mystics did not see this duality as blasphemy but as revelation. To them, the divine was not simple or singular. It was layered, complex, and infinite. Every force, even those deemed dark, existed for a reason. The task of humanity was not to deny the darkness but to illuminate it, to bring balance through understanding. In that sense, Lilith's myth becomes an invitation to face what we fear within ourselves and to see in it the reflection of the divine. Over centuries, as theological orthodoxy grew stricter, this nuanced view faded. Lilith was gradually stripped of her symbolic depth and reduced to superstition. In medieval Europe, she was blamed for misfortunes of the night, for sleeplessness, for desires that defied moral restraint. The old goddess who had once symbolized nature's freedom became a cautionary tale whispered at the edges of faith. Yet, even in demonization, her power endured. For myths, like rivers, cannot be stopped. They only find new paths to flow. In secret circles of mystics, alchemists, and philosophers, Lilith continued to be studied as a symbol of the soul's shadow, the part of the human psyche that longs for liberation from imposed boundaries. Renaissance thinkers saw in her the reflection of the anima, the inner feminine principle that guides the soul toward completeness. To integrate Lilith was to reconcile the self, to accept that wholeness requires both obedience and freedom, faith and curiosity, love and fear. And perhaps this is the deepest truth hidden within her story, that every exile contains a return. Lilith's flight from Eden was not the end of divine order but its expansion. Through her, humanity inherited the burden of choice, the freedom to seek, to question, and to grow. In this sense, she stands not against the Creator but as a reminder of what creation itself entails, the courage to step into the unknown. As the Middle Ages unfolded, the world that had once been ruled by the gods of stone and river gave way to an age of manuscripts and faith. Empires rose and fell, yet the invisible threads of myth remained unbroken. Deep within the scrolls of Jewish mysticism, in the quiet chambers of scholars and Kabbalists, Lilith found new life, not as a forgotten demon, but as an essential piece in the architecture of divine mystery. In the writings of the Zohar, composed in the late 13th century, Lilith emerges from the shadows of superstition and enters the sacred geometry of creation. The Zohar describes her as the reflection of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. Where the Shekinah represents divine compassion and the light of spiritual unity, Lilith embodies separation, division, and the exile of that same light. The mystics did not see this duality as punishment but as process, the continual rhythm of contraction and expansion through which the cosmos breathes. This mystical interpretation reveals something extraordinary. In Kabbalah, creation itself is not static perfection. It is a dynamic unfolding, a constant balancing act between forces of giving and receiving, light and vessel, order and chaos. Lilith, in this view, is not an adversary of God, but the shadow cast by divine light, the necessary counterpart that allows illumination to exist. Without her, there would be no awareness of contrast, no growth through choice. Her myth, when understood through this lens, becomes a theology of integration. Yet outside the halls of mysticism, the world was not so forgiving. The medieval imagination, shaped by fear of the unknown, began to reinterpret her through the lens of morality. The alphabet of Ben Sira, written around the 8th to 10th century, popularized the tale of Lilith as Adam's first wife, the one who refused subservience. This version spread widely, shaping centuries of interpretation. In the story, Lilith and Adam quarrel over equality. When she speaks the sacred name of God and flies from Eden, she is transformed, not by God, but by the human attempt to explain what cannot be controlled. The text tells that Lilith settled near the Red Sea, where she encountered beings of power and birthed countless spirits. But this imagery is symbolic. The Red Sea, in mystical allegory, is the border between the known and the unknown, the threshold between order and chaos. To dwell there is to live between worlds, in the realm where creation and destruction are one. Lilith's children are not literal offspring, but manifestations of unbridled energy, the raw potential that flows from freedom uncontained. Throughout the Middle Ages, artists and theologians alike struggled to categorize her. Some saw her as a seductress, others as a night spirit, a bringer of dreams. The truth is that Lilith became a canvas upon which humanity painted its fears of independence, sexuality, and spiritual power. Her wings, her gaze, her solitude, these were not the attributes of evil, but symbols of a deeper truth, that within every soul lies a force that refuses to be caged. In Kabbalistic cosmology, every emanation has its distortion, a reflection that mirrors its light in reverse. The mystics called this reflection Sitra Ara, the other side. It was not hell as later theology imagined it, but rather the spiritual residue of imbalance. Lilith was seen as the feminine essence of this other side, the shadow of Bina, the motherly sphere of understanding. In other words, she was the wisdom of God turned inward, not destroyed, but hidden, waiting for redemption through awareness. To these mystics, redemption was not merely the forgiveness of sin. It was the reintegration of what had been divided. The divine plan was seen as a restoration of unity, the return of all opposites into harmony. And Lilith's role in this cosmic story was not to be cast out forever, but to be understood. Her redemption would come not through punishment but through comprehension, through humanity's recognition that the shadow must be embraced, not feared. This profound insight finds echoes across the world's spiritual traditions. In Hindu thought, the goddess Kali represents a similar paradox. Terrifying yet compassionate, destroyer yet liberator. In Greek mystery cults, Hecate held the keys to the realms of life and death. In Egypt, Sekhmet's fury healed as much as it harmed. Lilith stands among these archetypes as the Semitic counterpart to the eternal feminine power that unites destruction and creation. Each of these deities, though separated by geography and language, points toward a single truth: the divine cannot be whole without its darkness. By the Renaissance, scholars of esotericism began to rediscover these correspondences. Alchemists, in particular, saw in Lilith a symbol of the nigredo, the black phase of transformation, when matter or spirit is dissolved before being purified. The alchemical process mirrored the human soul's journey: descent into darkness, confrontation with the shadow, and eventual rebirth into light. Lilith's exile from Eden, therefore, became an allegory for spiritual evolution. She represented the soul leaving the comfort of ignorance to face the trials of awareness. One of the most profound reinterpretations of her myth came from the early mystics of Safed in the 16th century, following the teachings of Isaac Luria. In Lurianic Kabbalah, the creation of the world begins with the Tzimtzum, the divine contraction, where God withdraws to make space for creation. But in this withdrawal, vessels of divine light shatter, scattering sparks throughout the cosmos. These sparks, trapped in shells of imperfection, form the broken world we inhabit. Lilith, in this mystical framework, represents those unredeemed sparks, divine energy exiled from its source, longing for reunion. The task of humanity, according to Luria, is tikkun olam, the repair of the world. Every act of awareness, compassion, and balance helps to restore the shattered vessels and bring the sparks back to their origin. Thus, even the darkest forces have a place in this restoration. Lilith's energy, once feared, becomes a crucial part of the divine economy, a force that must be acknowledged and integrated for creation to be complete. In this way, the mystics redeemed her not by erasing her shadow but by giving it meaning. Her presence also found its way into the art and literature of the Renaissance and early modern periods. Painters like Michelangelo and Dante Gabriel Rossetti depicted her not as a monster but as an emblem of forbidden beauty and eternal wisdom. In Rossetti's sonnet, Lilith is the witch he loved before the first, her beauty a reflection of divine perfection that blinds those who cannot see beyond the surface. To the poets, she was the embodiment of mystery, the veil between divine and mortal. Even within Christian mysticism, echoes of her symbolism appear. The tension between Mary and Eve, between purity and fall, mirrors the same duality embodied by Lilith and the Shekinah. The Church Fathers may not have spoken her name, but the archetype endured, the woman who holds both the fall and the redemption within her being. What emerges through these centuries is a profound realization that Lilith's myth is not simply about a woman or a demon, but about the human relationship to the unknown. She represents the forces that religion seeks to understand, psychology seeks to integrate, and philosophy seeks to name. She is the mirror of the human soul in its search for wholeness, and the unspoken acknowledgement that every light casts a shadow. As the Enlightenment dawned, and science began to replace myth as the language of truth, Lilith's presence faded from the collective mind. Yet she never disappeared entirely. Her story continued in folklore, in whispers of the night, in dreams that stirred the imagination of poets and mystics. For even when forgotten, the symbols that define humanity do not die. They merely sleep, waiting to be rediscovered by those willing to see beyond appearances. In the next part, we will explore how the modern age resurrected her once more, not as a figure of fear, but as an emblem of freedom, wisdom, and inner transformation. From occult revival to psychological archetype, from shadowed myth to symbol of awakening, Lilith's story continues to evolve, reminding us that what is exiled from consciousness will always seek to return. Before the name Lilith appeared in Hebrew scripture, before she became the dark reflection of Eve, she had already existed for more than 1,000 years in the sands and stones of ancient Mesopotamia. Her story was not a story of sin or rebellion, but of cosmic tension, the dance between the forces that gave life and those that threatened it. The Sumerians knew her not as a woman, but as a wind, a presence that swept through deserts and dwellings, invisible yet felt, feared yet revered. In their clay tablets, Lilitu, Ardent Lily, and Lamashtu appeared as echoes of this primordial wind. These were not mere demons. They were personifications of natural and psychological forces. Lamashtu, for instance, was believed to cause illness in infants, yet she was also invoked in protective amulets. In this paradox, we glimpse an ancient understanding that darkness itself could be used to shield against deeper darkness. Over time, the figure of Lilith began to absorb these fragments. She became the mask through which ancient humanity understood untamed femininity, sexual autonomy, and the mysteries of childbirth and night. In Sumerian myth, fertility and danger were inseparable. The same goddess who granted conception could also bring death in labor. The same storm that watered the crops could destroy them. The ancients saw in this a truth about the nature of existence, that creation and destruction were twins, born of the same divine womb. When these beliefs spread north into Akkad and Assyria, Lilith's role evolved further. She was no longer only a wind spirit but a figure that haunted thresholds, doorways, windows, and boundaries between worlds. This is deeply symbolic. Lilith was never meant to dwell in one realm. She existed between them, between human and divine, between night and dawn, between desire and fear. As centuries passed, Babylonian scribes began to merge older figures, Lamashtu, the Lilitu, the ardent lily, into a single archetype. In magical texts, she appears as a winged woman with bird-like feet, long hair cascading downward, holding the symbols of life and death. This image is found most vividly in the Burney relief, also known as the Queen of the Night. Scholars debate whether the figure truly represents Lilith or another goddess such as Ishtar or Ereshkigal, but the essence remains the same, the embodiment of feminine power unconstrained by social order. Ishtar ruled over love and war, life and death, and demanded worship as both giver and destroyer. Ereshkigal, her sister, reigned over the underworld, holding dominion over the final rest of souls. Lilith, in contrast, occupied the liminal space between them, neither goddess nor mortal, neither queen nor servant. She was an untethered essence, the wind of chaos that the gods themselves could not fully contain. When Hebrew exiles came into contact with Babylonian beliefs during the captivity, these ancient ideas naturally influenced their worldview. Lilith appears briefly in Isaiah 34 verse 14, in a passage describing a desolate land filled with haunting creatures. The Hebrew word Lilith is often translated as night creature or screech owl. Yet to those who knew the older myths, the meaning was clear. Lilith, the wandering spirit, the shadow of the sacred feminine, had crossed into the spiritual vocabulary of Israel. It was centuries later, in the alphabet of Ben Sira, that she would take on her most famous role, the first wife of Adam. In that story, she was formed from the same earth as him, not from his rib. When Adam demanded that she lie beneath him, she refused, saying that they were created equal. Speaking the divine name, she fled Eden, choosing exile over submission. Angels were sent to bring her back, but she would not return. From that moment, she was cursed, or perhaps liberated, to dwell at the edges of creation. This version of Lilith is not a historical invention but a spiritual synthesis, a merging of ancient Mesopotamian archetypes with the moral frameworks of later theology. She became a symbol of the dangers of autonomy, the power of refusal, and the cost of freedom. To some, she represented rebellion against divine order. To others, she was the embodiment of divine justice for a soul that could not bear subjugation. In mystical traditions, especially Kabbalah, Lilith evolved yet again. She became the dark reflection of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God. The two were mirrors of each other, one radiant with divine light, the other cloaked in shadow. Together, they represented the dual aspects of creation, light and dark, mercy and severity, form and void. In this light, Lilith was not evil but necessary, for without shadow, the light itself would have no definition. The Kabbalists saw her as dwelling within the Sitra Achra, the other side, the realm of imbalance that emerged when divine harmony was broken. Yet even there she served a purpose. Every force of darkness in their cosmology had its role: to test, to refine, to awaken. In this sense, Lilith became not a demon of hatred but a guardian of thresholds once again, the threshold between ignorance and awareness. Her story continued to evolve across centuries of art, literature, and esoteric philosophy. Medieval mystics saw her as the tempter of monks, a symbol of carnal distraction. Renaissance occultists reimagined her as the consort of Samael, the fallen angel. Romantic poets rediscovered her as the first feminist archetype, the woman who would rather wander eternally than kneel. And so, beneath every depiction of Lilith, the demon, the goddess, the outcast, lies a deeper truth. Humanity's struggle to understand the sacred feminine not merely as mother or maiden, but as something far older, far wilder, far more complete. Lilith reminds us that the divine feminine is not gentle submission alone. It is also storm, silence, and strength. She is not the denial of God, but the reflection of His creation's complexity. In her, we find not blasphemy, but balance, the shadow that defines the light. Through millennia of transformation from Sumer to Scripture, she has remained unchanged in one aspect. She is the unbroken wind that defies containment. To study Lilith is to study the untamable force within the cosmos, and within ourselves. When we step deeper into the shadowed corridors of Lilith's legacy, we begin to see that her myth is not merely a tale of rebellion, but a mirror reflecting the human soul's relationship with the divine. Every culture that touched her name reshaped her, not to redefine who she was, but to interpret what she revealed. Lilith became a cipher, a key to humanity's oldest questions. What is freedom? What is the cost of knowledge? And what happens when creation itself demands equality? The Hebrew mystics who inherited her story did not simply demonize her. They encoded her into the very structure of the universe. In the Kabbalistic tree of life, balance is everything. Between masculine and feminine, light and dark, mercy and judgment. When this balance is disrupted, creation trembles. Lilith, in this sacred geometry, represents the imbalance that awakens awareness. She is the reminder that without the shadow, the light would consume itself. According to certain mystical writings, Lilith became the queen of the night not as a punishment, but as a cosmic necessity. She ruled the realm where lost souls wandered, where desire and dream intertwined. Her domain was not hell nor heaven, but the vast space between, the realm of potential, where the soul confronts its own reflections. The ancients believed that through her, humanity could glimpse the unspoken side of divinity, the feminine aspect of God that cannot be contained in law or language. In some esoteric traditions, Lilith was linked to the moon. Not the radiant full moon of fertility rites, but the dark moon, invisible to the eye. This phase symbolized mystery, introspection, and the unseen power that governs cycles of life and death. Just as the moon disappears to be reborn, so too did Lilith vanish from sacred texts only to re-emerge in new forms, age after age. She was, in essence, the lunar shadow that made renewal possible. Throughout history, societies have feared the uncontained woman. In patriarchal systems, autonomy was seen as danger, independence as defiance. Lilith embodied both. She was not evil for refusing Adam. She was dangerous because she refused the world's definition of her place. This refusal echoed through centuries of myth-making, and even today, it resonates as a call for spiritual equality. Her story, when stripped of distortion, is less about sin and more about sovereignty. In medieval folklore, she was said to appear in dreams, not as a tormentor, but as a teacher. Those who encountered her often faced their own hidden desires, their suppressed instincts, their denied truths. In alchemical symbolism, Lilith became the prima materia, the raw, chaotic substance from which gold is refined. The alchemist's work was to integrate her, not to destroy her. To reject her darkness was to reject transformation itself. As Europe entered the Renaissance, Lilith's shadow found new light. Painters and poets began to see her not as a monster but as a muse. In Dante Gabriel Rossetti's art, she is the world's first woman, her hair a net of golden light, the same hair that ensnares the hearts of men, symbolizing the power of beauty and temptation. But beneath that beauty lies the deeper allegory, the eternal power of the feminine to enchant, to awaken, and to reveal hidden truth. In Jewish mysticism, Lilith remained a presence not to be worshipped, but to be understood. The Zohar teaches that she and the Shekinah are opposites in tension, yet one cannot exist without the other. The Shekinah is divine presence in harmony. Lilith is divine power in exile. Together, they represent the totality of creation, unity and separation, holiness and exile, the eternal cycle of descent and return. When the Shekinah is exiled, when compassion and balance are lost in the world, Lilith reigns. But when humanity restores harmony through love, wisdom, and awareness, Lilith's restless spirit is pacified. This mystical idea speaks not of a battle between good and evil, but of a dialogue between halves of the same divine whole. The deeper we travel into Lilith's myth, the more we realize that she never truly left Eden. She remained in its shadow, waiting for humanity to mature enough to understand her. In a sense, Lilith's departure from Adam is not an act of rebellion against God, but a necessary unfolding of divine will. Without separation, there can be no return. Without contrast, no comprehension. The first woman's refusal was also the first expression of choice, the seed of free will. This is perhaps the greatest hidden truth of all. Lilith's myth is not a tale of evil, but of evolution. She symbolizes the journey from innocence to awareness, from obedience to understanding. Her departure from paradise echoes the soul's own descent into matter, and its eternal yearning to reunite with the divine. She is both fall and awakening, curse and revelation. In ancient pagan wisdom, the divine feminine was never one-dimensional. The goddess was life-giver and life-taker, lover and destroyer, maiden and crone. Lilith inherited all these aspects. In her, we see the synthesis of Inanna's sensuality, Ereshkigal's depth, Isis's wisdom, and Hecate's mystery. She is the bridge connecting Mesopotamian temples, Egyptian tombs, Greek sanctuaries, and Hebrew visions, the universal archetype of sacred womanhood unbound. In modern times, her name continues to echo, not as a curse whispered in fear, but as a question. What does it mean to be free? Her myth challenges us to look beyond dogma and confront the shadows within our own faith and nature. To understand Lilith is to accept that the divine cannot be divided neatly into light and dark. Both are expressions of the same eternal essence. Through the lens of mythology, she becomes not a villain, but a vessel of truth. The ancients were telling us something profound, that to know creation, one must face the night as well as the dawn. Lilith is that night, not to be worshipped, but to be acknowledged. Not to be feared, but to be understood. She walks beside every seeker who dares to question, every soul who refuses false peace in exchange for truth. Her path is the narrow road between spirit and matter, faith and doubt, silence and song. And though her name has been called in whispers for 5,000 years, she remains what she always was, the wind that moves unseen through the world, reminding us that even in exile there is divinity. Lilith is not gone. She never was. She is the eternal question carried in the human heart, the question that even the gods cannot silence. If we listen carefully to the silence of history, we can still hear her breath in it. Lilith, the first to stand alone, the one who walked away from divine perfection, continues to haunt the boundaries between myth and revelation. Her name, carved into amulets and whispered in forbidden prayers, has outlasted empires and rewritten itself through every age. Each civilization that found her reshaped her story, not because she changed, but because humanity did. To the Babylonians, she was the howling wind that prowled outside their clay walls, a reminder that no man could fence the forces of nature. To the Hebrews, she was the first exile, a warning against pride but also a mirror reflecting the soul's hunger for autonomy. To the Gnostics, she was Sophia inverted, divine wisdom fallen into matter, still luminous beneath the weight of misunderstanding. And to the mystics of the Middle Ages, she became a code, a cipher for truths that could not be spoken openly in times of spiritual fear. But who was Lilith before names? Before scripture and symbol? Perhaps she was a memory, an echo of the first matriarchal age, when the goddess ruled not through domination but through cyclical renewal. Archaeologists have found clay figurines across Mesopotamia dating back to 4000 BCE. Women with exaggerated hips, wide eyes, and hands over their wombs. These were not idols of lust, but emblems of life itself. Some scholars believe that when patriarchal religions rose, these ancient goddesses were recast as monsters, and their sacred power renamed as danger. Lilith, then, became the memory of the sacred feminine exiled from heaven. Her story is the shadow version of Eve's, and that shadow tells us what was lost. When Eve was formed from Adam's rib, it symbolized unity through hierarchy, but Lilith's creation from the same earth as Adam symbolized equality through origin. The tension between them, between equality and submission, became one of the deepest spiritual conflicts in human history. In Lilith, the ancient world expressed what could not be spoken in law or temple. That the feminine, like the divine itself, cannot be owned. Ancient texts tell us that after leaving Eden, Lilith dwelled near the Red Sea, a place of desolation and transformation. The Red Sea was a liminal space, where land meets abyss, where slavery ends and freedom begins. In mystical symbolism, this is the place where the soul confronts its own chaos before liberation. Perhaps that is why Lilith fled there, not in punishment, but to inhabit the spiritual wilderness where revelation is born. In esoteric readings, the Red Sea represents the unconscious, the deep waters of intuition, emotion, and ancestral memory. Lilith, as queen of that sea, became the ruler of what the rational mind fears, the unseen depths of the psyche. Just as ancient sailors feared to sail beyond the horizon, ancient theologians feared to venture into the spiritual territories she governed. Yet that is precisely where wisdom hides. As centuries passed, the image of Lilith evolved in secret texts. In the treatise on the left emanation, a 13th century Kabbalistic work, she appears as the partner of Samael, not as an enemy of God, but as the necessary counterpart to divine perfection. Together, they form the shadow twin of Adam and Eve, mirroring the human world from beyond the veil. This pairing represents not evil in the moral sense, but the balance of opposites in cosmic law, a reminder that creation itself is built upon polarity. To the mystics, the union of Lilith and Samael symbolized the dangers of imbalance. When divine energies are misaligned, when wisdom is cut off from compassion or power from restraint, chaos manifests. But chaos, in their understanding, was not punishment. It was correction. Lilith's presence in mystical cosmology was not an intrusion but a necessary counterweight. She was the energy that forced order to remember its source. In the language of alchemy, she became the nigredo, the blackening stage, where matter dissolves before rebirth. The alchemist's vessel was often described as the womb of Lilith, for within that darkness, all transformation began. Before the gold could shine, it had to die and be reborn through her night. Thus, even in medieval occultism, her myth preserved its ancient root. Creation and destruction intertwined. Lilith's influence reached even further, into early Christianity, though the Church never named her outright. In the apocryphal texts, especially those inspired by Gnostic thought, one can feel her shadow beneath the figure of Mary Magdalene, the woman misunderstood, condemned, and yet bearing secret wisdom. Both women, in their own ways, challenge the same archetype, the idea that spiritual truth must be silent and obedient. Lilith's defiance became, centuries later, the symbol of the voice that refuses to be erased. By the time of the Renaissance, her image had transformed again. She appeared in grimoires as a name of power, invoked not in blasphemy, but in the recognition of duality. In mystical poetry, she became the emblem of the soul's longing for freedom. In the Zohar, it is said that Lilith flees at the mention of sacred names, yet this too carries symbolic meaning. She represents what retreats when light shines upon ignorance. To know her truly is not to fear her, but to understand what she guards. In ancient and modern mysticism alike, Lilith is the guardian of boundaries, the keeper of gates between the conscious and the unconscious, the sacred and the profane, heaven and earth. She tests those who seek hidden knowledge, ensuring that only those who can face their own shadows may proceed. Her myth thus transforms from one of seduction and exile into one of initiation. To meet Lilith is to confront the parts of ourselves that remain untamed, the passions we deny, the truths we hide, the questions we are too afraid to ask. She is not an external demon but an internal mirror. Those who fear her often fear themselves. Yet those who approach her with humility and wisdom may find, behind her darkness, the face of divine completeness. For in the end, Lilith's truth is not about her at all, it is about us. About the eternal human journey between obedience and freedom, light and shadow, faith and understanding. She is the unspoken chapter of creation, the story of what happens when the soul remembers it was made not only to serve but to know. Before there was scripture, before ink met parchment and divine law became written order, there were stories. Stories told in flickering firelight, whispered beside rivers, carved into clay. Among them, one name has lingered longer than almost any other: Lilith. She is older than the Bible, older than the kings of Babylon, older even than the walls of UR. She was born not from one culture, but but from the collective dream of humanity's earliest civilizations. A dream that spoke of the sacred, the shadow, and the eternal dance between the two. To understand the full depth of Lilith's myth, one must return to the beginning, not of Eden, but of the ancient world that shaped her. In the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates, life itself was divine. Every river, every wind, every star had spirit and meaning. There, gods were not distant but immanent. They walked with humanity, governed by the same passions, flaws, and hungers. And among those ancient deities, the feminine was central. The earliest Sumerian records speak not of one god above all, but of a divine partnership. Heaven and earth were lovers, and creation was born through their union. In this world of balance, goddesses like Inanna, Ninhursag, and Ereshkigal ruled alongside their male counterparts. They were creators and destroyers, healers and warriors. There was no shame in their power. It was simply another face of the divine. Yet as centuries passed, this equilibrium began to shift. The rise of male-dominated pantheons slowly diminished the sovereignty of the feminine. Where once goddesses ruled with thunder and wisdom, they became consorts, mothers, or tempters. Powerful still, but constrained. It was in this cultural transformation that Lilith emerged as the outsider. She carried within her the memory of the old world, a time when the divine feminine was wild and free, ungoverned by hierarchy. The winds that once whispered her name across the plains of Mesopotamia became the same winds that rustled through the Garden of Eden. Her essence was eternal. The spirit of autonomy, the embodiment of sacred rebellion against control. In Sumerian incantations, Lilith's earliest form, Lilitu, was not purely demonic. She represented the spirit of air, the unseen energy that filled the night. She was feared not because she was evil, but because she was unpredictable, a force of nature that defied domestication. To the ancients, this was the divine mystery. Everything that could give life could also take it away. Lilith was that paradox personified. When Hebrew theology absorbed elements of Babylonian and Assyrian cosmology, Lilith's role was reinterpreted through a moral lens. What the Sumerians saw as balance, later faiths saw as danger. The goddess who once symbolized independence became the demon who fled obedience. Her story in the alphabet of Ben Sira is not just a myth. It is a reflection of an evolving world, one where the free woman no longer fit into the sacred order. The narrative of Lilith leaving Eden is powerful because it reveals a universal truth about human consciousness. Eden, in its essence, is the state of divine unity. Innocence before knowledge. But innocence cannot remain forever. The soul must confront duality to grow. Lilith's departure symbolizes that first awakening, the painful realization that divine unity requires awareness, and awareness demands choice. She did not fall, she evolved. From the moment she left the garden, humanity's relationship with her became one of projection. Every fear of feminine autonomy, every anxiety about desire, every moral struggle with freedom was cast upon her form. The rabbis wrote of her as the seducer of men, the bringer of nightmares, the mother of demons. Yet beneath these tales lies a profound psychological insight. She is the shadow of the divine feminine suppressed by centuries of spiritual imbalance. In the language of Jungian psychology, Lilith is the anima shadow, the repressed aspect of the soul's inner feminine. In both men and women, this represents the untamed emotional and creative power buried beneath social conformity. When denied, it emerges in distorted forms: obsession, fear, projection. But when acknowledged, it becomes the very energy that restores wholeness. This, too, is part of her truth. If one studies the evolution of her iconography, this transformation becomes visible. The Burney relief, that mysterious Babylonian plaque of a winged woman with owl's feet, stands as one of her oldest depictions. Her wings stretch wide, her eyes unblinking, her stance both regal and defiant. She holds the ankh of life in each hand, flanked by lions, symbols of power and sovereignty. She is no demon here, but a goddess, mistress of air and life. Over time, however, her image was fragmented. The wings that once represented transcendence became marks of exile. The lions became her captors rather than her guardians. The shift from goddess to demon was not her transformation, but ours. When the Hebrew scriptures mention the Lilith in Isaiah, it is as a creature of desolation, one who inhabits the ruins. Yet there is irony in this. Ruins are not just remnants of destruction, but places where old worlds meet new. Lilith, the spirit of the ruins, is the bridge between civilizations, the memory that refuses to die even when temples fall. She is the lingering echo of humanity's first vision of the sacred feminine. As the world entered late antiquity, her story was reshaped again. In Gnostic writings, she becomes the consort of Samhael, the angel of severity. Together, they are the shadow side of creation, necessary for divine balance. The Gnostics believed that the material world was born from the tension between divine wisdom, Sophia, and her separation from the source. In this cosmology, Lilith becomes the manifestation of that separation, not as sin, but as the yearning to return. She is the soul's longing for reunion with the divine. In this interpretation, her exile is not punishment but pilgrimage. Like the soul cast into matter, Lilith wanders through creation seeking understanding. Her story becomes the story of humanity itself, the descent into knowledge, the encounter with suffering, and the eventual return to truth. Every myth of exile, from Prometheus to the prodigal son, carries her essence. During the medieval and Renaissance periods, Lilith's image expanded further, blending with the occult and mystical traditions of Europe. The Kabbalists saw her as the embodiment of the unbalanced feminine energy, not to be hated, but to be harmonized. The alchemists saw in her the black phase of transmutation, the fertile darkness from which enlightenment is born. Even in Christian mysticism, her presence lingers subtly. The Virgin Mary and Lilith represent two sides of the same divine coin, one sanctified, the other exiled. The mother and the outcast. Together, they form the full circle of womanhood and divinity. Modern spiritual philosophy continues to reinterpret her, peeling away centuries of fear. Feminist mystics of the 20th century began to see her as the first voice of resistance. Throughout the ages, Lilith's name has never disappeared. Whispered in ancient temples, sung in hidden hymns, and feared in the prayers of exorcists, she has traveled from clay tablets to the pages of holy texts, from myth to archetype, from demon to goddess, from memory to symbol. Her journey is not only that of a figure cast into darkness, it is the mirror of how civilizations have wrestled with the mystery of the feminine itself. In the beginning, the world did not divide creation into light and dark, male and female, good and evil. The gods of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Sumer were whole, beings of totality. Inanna, Ishtar, Isis, and Hathor all carried within them both tenderness and terror, life and destruction, creation and decay. The sacred feminine was vast, encompassing both the nurturing mother and the consuming night. But something shifted as humanity sought control over the unpredictable rhythms of nature and desire. The earliest agricultural empires needed order, predictability, hierarchy. The cycles of chaos that once represented fertility began to be feared. The serpent, once a sacred emblem of rebirth, was recast as a deceiver. The goddess of the dark moon, once a guardian of thresholds, was turned into a spirit of exile. Lilith's transformation from divine to demonic is not merely a story about her. It is a story about humanity's attempt to master what it could not fully understand, its own shadow. When the early Hebrews encountered the Babylonian and Sumerian traditions, they inherited echoes of this older world. In the Talmudic imagination, Lilith was said to have been the first companion of Adam, not born from his rib, but equal to him in form and will. Her refusal to submit to him, her flight from Eden, and her dwelling in the wilderness were retellings of far older myths of goddesses who rejected confinement. In this sense, Lilith was never meant to be evil. She was the embodiment of autonomy. In Sumer, her predecessors were known as the Lilu and Lilitu, spirits of wind and night. They were neither purely benevolent nor malevolent, but messengers between worlds. The wind was sacred, invisible yet present, carrying voices from beyond. When these ancient concepts entered the theological frameworks of later monotheism, ambiguity became heresy. What could not be classified as of God was cast as opposition to him. Thus, Lilith's image was broken apart. Her wings became signs of rebellion, her independence became sin, and her connection to nature's cycles became a mark of impurity. She was chained in myth because the feminine mysteries she embodied could not be contained within the emerging patriarchal order. Yet across centuries she persisted. Medieval mystics spoke her name with caution, But artists and alchemists began to see in her something different: the lost balance of the cosmos. To the alchemists, the feminine principle was the prima materia, the black soil of potentiality from which all gold is born. They saw Lilith not as a temptress, but as the shadow necessary for transformation. The alchemical marriage, the union of the sun and the moon, of sulfur and mercury, of king and queen, could not be complete without her. In the Zohar, the great mystical text of Kabbalah, Lilith is portrayed with terrifying beauty, the queen of the night. Yet within the same mystical vision lies the understanding that darkness itself is part of the divine mystery. The Shekinah, the feminine presence of God, is exiled, fragmented, awaiting reunion. And some mystics whispered, perhaps Lilith is her reflection, distorted by the mirror of human fear. In esoteric traditions of the Renaissance and beyond, Lilith re-emerged as a cipher for forbidden knowledge. Secret societies and occult philosophers studied her myth not to worship her, but to understand the hidden dynamics of nature and psyche. In the secret language of alchemy, Lilith was not a being but a process, the confrontation with what the soul denies. To face Lilith was to meet one's own pride, desire, and unacknowledged potential. By the 19th century, the myth evolved once more. Romantic poets and painters reclaimed her as the eternal muse, the woman unbound, the symbol of passion and rebellion. John Collier's famous painting Lilith depicted her with flowing hair and a serpent coiled around her body. Not as a monster, but as a living symbol of beauty entwined with mystery. The Victorians feared her, yet could not look away. In modern psychology, the story found new meaning. Carl Jung saw in figures like Lilith the archetype of the dark feminine, the part of the collective unconscious that humanity repressed. She became the anima shadow, the rejected counterpart of the male psyche. To integrate Lilith was not to glorify rebellion, but to restore wholeness. For within the human spirit, what is cast out always returns, seeking recognition. Across myths, Lilith remains the guardian of thresholds, the desert, the night, the edge of dreams. She is found in the silence between breaths, in the moment when fear meets desire, in the stillness before transformation. The ancients called her the howling wind. But what if that wind is not a cry of malice? What if it is the voice of the soul calling humanity to face its forgotten half? In the deeper symbolic reading, Lilith's exile mirrors humanity's own. The story of Eden, whether read literally or allegorically, is also the story of separation, the division between heaven and earth, spirit and matter, man and woman. Lilith's departure from Eden represents the soul's longing for freedom, while Eve's creation symbolizes the soul's reconciliation with divine order. Both are aspects of the same truth. The forbidden fruit, the serpent, the voice in the garden, all reflect ancient echoes of the older mystery schools. In them, knowledge was never evil. It was sacred. But knowledge without humility could burn like fire. That is the essence of the Lilith myth, the danger and power of awakening before one is ready to bear the light. In every era, her story adapts to reflect the collective consciousness of the time. In the past, she was feared as a demon who stole infants, a tragic distortion of her ancient role as a midwife of souls, a guardian of birth and transition. In later ages, she became the muse of artists and revolutionaries, the emblem of those who refused to conform. Today, she has become a symbol for inner awakening, a reminder that the human soul must reclaim both light and shadow to become whole. Lilith's myth endures because she cannot be defined. She is not only a character from ancient lore, she is an archetype, a mirror, a question. Every civilization that tells her story is, in truth, speaking about itself. Perhaps that is why her name persists, even when forbidden. The ancients understood that names hold power, for to name something is to call it into awareness. To speak Lilith is to confront the part of ourselves that resists submission, that hungers for authenticity, that remembers the wildness before the walls of civilization were built. In the end, the hidden truth about Lilith is not merely about an ancient goddess or a demonized myth. It is about the forgotten dimension of the sacred feminine, the wisdom that dwells in mystery, not in clarity, in intuition, not in law, in silence, not in command. Her story is the story of humanity's exile from itself and its long journey home. But perhaps she never left. Perhaps Lilith still walks in the wilderness, whispering through the trees, watching the cities that rose from the dust of Eden. Perhaps she waits not for worship, but for remembrance, for the moment when humanity will finally understand that darkness was never the enemy, only the other face of the divine light. And when that day comes, the myth will no longer divide us. It will unite the serpent and the dove, the night and the dawn, the first woman and the last man, within the eternal circle of the One.